Okay, so let's continue with where we left off in the last video, absolute value equations. Remember that when we are talking about absolute value, we're actually talking about a distance from zero. So, for example, this equation here where we are trying to figure out what n equals, this statement or this equation is saying that the absolute value of n is 5. In other words, n is 5 units from zero. So when we go to the number line and look at those numbers that are 5 units from 0, we find that we have positive 5 and negative 5 as possible solutions for the value of n. In fact, those are the solutions. Okay, so let's take a look at this equation. This one is an absolute value of x over 8. The absolute value of x over 8 is equal to 1. In other words, the expression x over 8 is 1 unit from 0. So that means that x over 8, the expression x over 8, could either equal negative 1 or 1. So what we're going to say is that since this is where x over 8 is on the absolute value, on the number line, then we will say that x over 8 can equal negative 1 and x over 8 can equal positive 1. But there's a little bit more work to do in order to get the value of x. So now we are going to separately solve each equation by multiplying both sides of the equations by 8. So in the first equation we get x equals negative 8, and in the second equation we get x equals 8. This number line up here does not show us the solutions. It shows us the two values of the expression before we solve. So this is not the graph of the solution. This is just helping us understand where to start our equations. Okay, so we're going to take a look at another example. It still says example 2, but this is obviously not the second example. Something that we need to make sure we understand is that whenever you see absolute value equations, you have to get the absolute value expression, this thing here that is inside the absolute value bars, you have to get it isolated. You have to get it by itself so that you know what distance from 0 you are working. So in this case, I need to actually cancel out the 7, or the division of 7 needs to be reversed by multiplying both sides of the equation by 7. So by doing that, I will see that the absolute value of 4n plus 10, this expression, has an absolute value of 28. In other words, 4n plus 10 is both at positive 28 and negative 28, because we're looking at a distance from 0. This expression starts at negative 28 and at positive 28. That's not the solution yet. This is just helping me understand what I should set 4n plus 10 equal to so I can solve. So 4n plus 10 equals negative 28 and 4n plus 10 equals positive 28. Now I can take the steps to solve both of these equations and isolate my values for n. So I'm going to subtract 10 on both sides of the equal sign for both of these equations. And then I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides of the equal sign for both equations and simplify. When I divide by 4, there's a little simplifying that I can do, and you'll see that the solutions are negative 19 over 2 and 9 over 2. So n equals both of these values. Again, this graph up here is not the graph of the solution. It is just the graph that helps us understand what we can set both of our equations equal to, because we are working on two sides of 0. Okay, so let's take a look at example 4. It's a little more complicated, but not a ton of extra work. Again, in the last example, we said that we need to get the absolute value completely isolated so that we know we want absolute value equals whatever number on the right side. We need to know the distance from 0 that we are working with. So in order to isolate this, I need to do the math undo all the math around it. So that's, again, the reverse order of operations. So I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides to start. And I can't distribute, I should not distribute 4 into the absolute value symbols. Instead, I'm going to divide that away because I'm trying to get this expression inside the absolute value to be isolated so that I know the distance from 0. So I'm dividing both sides by 4. And negative 24 divided by 4 gives us a value of negative 6. Now, if this value were positive, that would mean that we have a distance that we could count away from 0, because absolute value means distance from 0. However, this is telling us that the distance of this expression from 0 is -6. That's a problem. We cannot work with negative distances. There's no such thing as a negative distance. So because this absolute value is set equal to a negative, this particular equation has no solution. If this had a distance that was positive, then we could work on both sides of the 0, and we could go on to solve for two different values. But because the absolute value is set equal to a negative, there is no solution. It's really important to remember that as you work with absolute value.